Alright, so now to look at some word problems. So just a reminder, there are 3 basic steps to these word problems, besides of course reading them. The first thing you do is define the variable, then you're going to write and solve an equation, and then you're going to interpret your solution in a sentence, being careful of units. So just a reminder, context problems deserve a context solution. It simply means that you should always be writing your answer as a sentence. Okay, so number 9. Julio has $5 more than Dan. So that sounds kind of important. Julio has $5 more than Dan. Altogether, Julio and Dan have $19. How much money does each young man have? So that is our question. How much money does each young man have? Now, on part A here it says, let D represent the amount of money in dollars that Dan has. So they have actually told us what our variable is. So up here where it says define a variable, sometimes the problem does that for you. So in this case, our D represents the amount of money in dollars that Dan has. We don't have to define the variable because they've already done it for us. Use D to write an expression. Now this is a big deal. Okay, they don't want the whole equation. They just want an expression. Expression is not a full sentence. It's not an equals. That represents the amount of money that Julio has. So Julio has $5 more than Dan. We're going to write Julio's expression in terms of Dan. So D represents Dan. If Julio has $5 more than Dan, the expression that would represent Julio would be D plus 5. So this is Julio. Okay, D plus 5 is Julio. That is an expression. Okay, big deal here, because a lot of times I'll put something like this on a test and I'll get the entire equation. I don't want an equation, I want an expression. So now on part B it says write an equation to represent the situation. So let's think this through. We have Julio plus Dan, and that's going to equal $19 because that's how much money they have all together. So Julio's expression is D plus 5. Dan's expression is just D. So remember up here, D represented Dan. So that's plus another D equals 19. So this here is my equation. D plus 5 plus D equals 19. So now in part C they say solve the equation from part B showing each step. Justify each step with a property or explanation. So I want you to do that now. Again, we have the equation D plus 5 plus D equals 19. So I want you to solve and justify every step. When you're ready, turn the video back on. Alright, so here's our steps. We have our given. Now, you may not have included the commutative property of addition, but in order to combine like terms, that's what you're doing. You got to put those terms together. So this is kind of an important step to include anytime they're told to justify when you're combining like terms. Get the terms in the same kind of back to back. Alright, then combine like terms, subtraction property of equality, combine like terms again because anytime you're adding or subtracting, that's combining like terms. Divide with the property of equality, and then when you're dividing, it's going to be a simplification. Now, on part D, it says interpret your solution from part C within the context of the problem. So this 7, if you recall, D represents Dan's amount of money in dollars. So this 7 represents that Dan has $7. So that's what we're going to put here. Dan has $7. But here's the problem. That's not the only thing they asked us to do. If we go back up to the top here, it says how much does each boy or young man have? Well, we know Dan has $7. So how much does Julio have? Well, if we go back to Julio's expression of D plus 5, Julio would have 7 plus 5. So Julio has $12. So now we've answered both parts of the question. This is why you always must go back to the original problem and see what they're asking for, because sometimes they ask for more than what your answer gives. And if you just box 7, then you've not answered the whole thing. Now E says, verify the reasonableness, that's a good word, reasonableness, oops, of your solution by checking that your answer matches the information given in the situation. So they tell us that together they have $19, right? Well, let's check the reasonableness of this. 7 plus 12 equals 19. So they had $19. Okay, that's reasonable. That makes sense. And then it also said that Julio had $5 more. So Julio has $5 more. And let's check this out. Julio has more money, so that checks out as well. So our answers are reasonable. Okay, always check for reasonableness. Okay, you can always go back and look. Sometimes think of another method. Sometimes making a table, sometimes guessing and checking, sometimes drawing a picture. Always try to double check to make sure your answer is reasonable. All right, number 9. It says, in item 9, the variable J could have been defined as the amount of money in dollars that Julio has. So this time, instead of writing this in terms of D, Dan's money, we're going to let J represent the amount of money in dollars that Julio has. So they want us to write an expression that represents the amount of money that Dan has. Alright, so we're kind of going to go back up here to number 9. Let's go back up here and look. Julio has $5 more than Dan. Okay, so that's what we're going to use to write our expression. So Julio has $5 more than Dan. Kind of need that. That's very important. So if J represents Julio, and we're trying to write our expression for Dan this time. So Julio, this time, if Julio has $5 more than Dan, this means that Dan has $5 less than Julio. So notice how this changes our expression. In our first problem, we had D plus 5 because we represented the variable D being Dan's money. However, this time by writing it in terms of Julio with a J, it completely changes the expression, which means it's going to completely change our equation. Because this time when we have Dan and Julio, and it equals $19, Dan this time is J minus 5, and Julio is J. This is a totally different equation. So when we solve this, we'd have 2J minus 5 equals 19. Add our 5. So 2J equals 24. So this time Julio has 12. We got the answer 12. Look up here. When we did this before, we got the answer 7 for D. So this is why it's so important that you actually write down what your variables mean. Because depending on the variable you use, it's going to completely change the equation, and it could change the solution you get. Now, it's not going to change the final answer, which is why you have to write it as a sentence. Because this time when we interpret our solution here, okay, we're going to start by saying, well, Julio has $12, which means Dan, if we go back up to our expression on part A, Dan has 12 minus 5, which is going to be 7. So our interpretation was the same, but our equation and our solving was different. So again, this is why you have to read. You have to go back and select a variable. Sometimes they do it for you. Sometimes they give you the choice. And that's okay, but that's why you always have to define a variable. That's the first step. So then part D says, does the definition of the variable in the problem situation change the solution to the problem? Well, yes, we just talked about that. Yes, it does. Okay, you would have gotten that Julio has $12 this time. Okay, instead of Dan's $7. So yeah, it absolutely changed it. So this is why defining a variable is so incredibly important. Okay?